covering is we're going to hit the rules of the road here in just a second. We're going to talk about the presentation and kind of what to expect. We're going to talk about being better together, the Red Hat and Dell and Microsoft story. We've been together a long time, producing some great solutions together. We'll also talk about SQL strategy and journey. We'll talk about why SQL. Then we'll address the fully supported stack, which is an exciting topic to talk about because it's completely put together as a stack, a solution that's validated and tested, and you're going to see what we have to present to you there. You're going to really like that today. As well as we'll talk some about containers, kind of the hot topic today, Kubernetes and things like that, and OpenShift and BDC. We'll also talk about ARC and Q&A, and then we'll give you some great resources and contacts to reach out to us if you have any questions. Now, what we'd like to do today is cover a couple of rules of the road. Just so you know, this webinar is being recorded. It will also be posted publicly after this is done on Bright Talk as well as on our Dell page, so we will send that out later. We will also send out the links and the information that you see at the end. You can screenshot it if you like, but also we will be sending that out to you as a response saying thank you for attending. You will get some links today with that. So we would appreciate it that you being here today. We also have a Q&A section today. So if you are going to run into a question or you have a thought or a comment on a slide that we're talking about, please feel free to put that in the Q&A window. We will not be enabling the chat function for you today, so please don't use the chat function. Just use the Q&A section in the Zoom call today. So please just put your questions in there. We'll do our best to get to them. If it's a hot topic, looks like something we want to interrupt the presentation, this is definitely going to be a flow and a conversation, so please feel free to do so and not just hold your questions to the end. We'd love to address them as we go. Also, we'll be taking some polls today, so we're going to need your help to make this presentation a success. It's not just about Steve and myself and Rob. We actually need you guys to interact with us and give us some of your experience. And we're going to ask you some questions, and we'd like you to respond. And we're going to go through that next here in just a second. And then finally, the contact information that we will provide to you and links at the end. Again, like I said, we will be sending out an email with all that information for you. All right? Now, next, polls. So the polls that we're going to be using today and the program that we're using is called Poll Everywhere. You can install the app on your phone with either the Android or the iPhone on the App Store. So while I'm talking here, if you want to head out there to your App Store, you can download it. It's super easy to use, installs in about 30 seconds. You're good to go. But you can also join by text. So if you have an old BlackBerry around or whatever you have, or if you had a pager like back in the day, my wife used to text me 411 or 911 on my text there on the pager, so I knew what to call her back. But you can join by text if you want to, but you can also join by the web. And since most of you are at home right now, that's probably very easy for you to do. Just head out to pollev.com, and then you're in Dell Poll, DELLPOLL. Then it's going to ask for your name. So just put up whatever you like, whatever name you'd like to be called, Captain Hook or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's all good. Put it in what you'd like there. And then the polls will actually walk you through as we go through each one of them. There's about 5 or 6 polls we have today to ask you some different questions to help guide the conversation for us today. So again, you can join by text, right, and put in Dell Poll to 22333, or you can join by the web going to pollev.com and enter Dell Poll and then enter your name and then respond to the activity. You can also download the Android or iPhone app and use it on your phone or mobile device of your choice. All right, we'll go ahead and hit our first poll and give you guys your first test of the day to see how well we can follow instructions today. The first poll will be, I was aware that Microsoft SQL can run on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Now that's new. Since 2017, we've been able to do that. So, I gave it away. I gave you guys a softball. But yeah, if you can just answer that you were aware that that was possible for you. But yes, since 2017, SQL's 2017, we've been able to do that. But some folks, out there may think it only runs on Windows, and it's good to know, right? It does run on Linux, and not just Red Hat, but Red Hat distribution is the most popular distribution out there, and we are going to talk a little bit about that today. First question: you guys are doing great. So we've got about 75% of you, or 2/3 to 3/4 of you here that looks like you guys know that it runs on Linux, which is fantastic. And it looks like we've got a great number of attendees here today. We've got about 85 of you that have joined us today, so thank you for joining. And keep responding there. Let's see, it looks like we've got, all right. Well, I'm going to move on to the next one. So it looks like most of you know that you can run Microsoft SQL 2017 or 2019 on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So great. Thank you for that. We got another easy question for you coming up. All right. My organization runs Microsoft SQL on Red Hat Enterprise Linux today. So I'm going to actually clear this because it looked like it got, I'll reset it and you guys respond. There we go. Thank you. Sorry about that. There we go. All right. So it sounds like several of you actually do run or do not run actually run it on Linux today. Only just 13% of you. And then it looks like 88% of you probably run it on Windows, right? All right. We'll give it just another second here to gather some of that information. Awesome. And maybe in the Q&A section, if you're not running on a Red Hat Enterprise Linux, are you running it on other Linux distributions? Maybe in the Q&A, if you mind posting, are you running it on SUSE or some other, distribution? It'd just be good to know. All right, awesome. Let's move on to, we have one more poll question before we get into to everything else. So, all right. So my organization runs the following versions of Microsoft SQL. You can answer more than once, so usually that's the case, right? Most organizations run multiple versions of Microsoft SQL, right? So it's very common that, that you would run, 2008. A lot of people still out there running that. 2016, it looks like, is the clear winner right now. We had some, Steve and Rob and I had some bets as to who, which one of these was going to take it. Right now, I think 2016 is taking the winners circle at the moment. Looks like a lot of you, I'm actually surprised at the adoption on 2019. That's great. It's good to see that a lot of you are already running 2019 out there today.
It's funny, Trey, we had a quick comment from Ted in the Q&A. I'll answer this live. SQL 2005 and 2000 and even 6, yep. We didn't have those on the poll here, but I still see that, so it's super interesting. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome. Well, thank you for all that. It's great to see that information pop up there. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about here, now that we've done with the polls, gave you guys some easy questions to answer. So thank you so much for joining in and answering that, and especially the question around what happened to 2000, 2005, and 6.0. I was back there in those days doing some migrations. In fact, I did a couple of those migrations on a submarine, actually, down in San Diego. I'd lay on the floor and run the scripts and do the upgrades while I sat on the floor with the timer because I couldn't leave the submarine until I was done. So good times. Let's talk about the alliance. So the Red Hat Alliance is very strong with Dell. We have a great relationship with Red Hat. We've been partners with them for 21 years. So, it started, the Red Hat company as a whole started in 1993. We were partners with them in 1999. And so we've been together with them a very, very long time. We've been offering co-engineered solutions, so SQL on RHEL, like we're talking about today, SQL BDC OpenShift, PowerEdge, VxRail, our vSAN product line. All of our storage products work together very closely with all the product lines at Red Hat. We also have a lot of co-offerings. So we offer solutions in Microsoft solutions and Red Hat solutions through our OEM programs, right? So it's attached to a physical box. And we also have Dell partner software with us here today as well. And those guys, we sell all the different products that Red Hat has to offer, OpenShift and Ansible, right? And Red Hat Enterprise Linux and Red Hat Enterprise Linux for SAP. So we offer all of those through our Dell partner software. We also have a very rich and very long, probably our longest partnership out there with any of our partners that we have since pretty much the beginning of Dell, a 35-year partnership with Microsoft that goes back 35 years ago. So we have a great relationship between the companies. In fact, we have a lot of meetings and, meeting of the minds between Red Hat, Dell, and Microsoft together, and that's why we have some of the great minds here with us on the phone today. But there's a strong partnership between all three companies, and so we're excited today to present some of our solutions that we have, talk about, kind of what in your environment, what that might look like. And so I'm going to move on to the next slide here. We're going to talk about the SQL and strategy around Microsoft SQL. And Steve, I'm going to hand it over to you, sir.
Good deal. Thanks, Trey. Howdy, everybody. I'm noticing that there's people all over the world. I see a couple of people that I know from EMEA that joined in. So we got a broad audience of, based off the polling detail, some very forward-looking thinkers that are already installing 2019. Well, let's talk about that stuff. As a matter of fact, the icons that Trey has, if you go back to the slide, the icons that Trey has here is pretty interesting. We were talking about this earlier around just the flow of data, right? Something gets created and filtered and stored, and then you do stuff with it or analytics, and that's really going to be the flow of the detail today. So if we go to the next slide and we think about it with, we'll take our Red Hat colored glasses off. We'll put the Microsoft colored glasses on just for a second here and recognize, that Microsoft and SQL, they've been pretty aggressive over the last few years around this idea of the data focus. And I remember at Dell Technology World last year, Michael Dell stood up and said that 2020 will be the start of the data decade, and that definitely is true. And Microsoft's all in on this, and they're not the only ones. Oracle, SAP, open architectures, Hadoop, all of those things are happening. And Microsoft, in recognizing the primacy of the data story, has really done some interesting stuff. Way back in 2016, they imported some cool stuff that was only available on the analytics platform system, and then they said, hey, that's fantastic. We'll go to 2017 and we'll disconnect it from having to run on Windows Server. And so, Trey, you were talking about that a minute ago. That was when that started, was 2017, to where I can pull off of it being on Windows Server and run it on Enterprise Linux and Red Hat and applications like that. And then in 2019, they said, okay, we're going to pump a bunch of steroids into this again and do all kinds of cool things where I can integrate all the data. And I paused before all on purpose. It's literally all underlined. Any data sources out there, there's ways to do that. Leveraging Polybase, leveraging some tools. We'll talk about that as we peel back the layers of what's available from a SQL perspective. But the reality is the data silos and the data gravity, whether that's happening in public cloud or in your data center or even at the edge, the desire to touch all that data from a Microsoft perspective is available today. It's nice to be able to touch the data, but getting insights off of that data is what's critically important. And so managing that data and then driving some of these advanced feature functionality. And there's a alphabet soup of AI, ML, DL, cognitive service. There's a whole list of things that you can do off of that data. And the reality is, and you've probably seen this with some of the recent announcements that happened last week at Microsoft's Ignite conference, where a SQL Server has been the foundational bedrock that we see within data centers for quite a long time. SQL Server is no longer your daddy's SQL Server. The capabilities of it having a true hybrid environment and having more of a data services conversation around the unification of how I'm deploying and managing and governing and tooling and how am I doing that, if it's cloud down or virtualization up, all of those things are in play today. So it's a fantastic time to be talking about this from a SQL perspective. And if we go to the next slide, real quick, the install base that we see with SQL is, well, it's off the charts. If you look at it from a dollar perspective, Oracle and SQL are about hand in hand, but SQL is quite a bit less expensive. A lot of stuff comes just within the box with SQL. So from IDC's data, we're reflecting, Microsoft SQL is literally the most widely used database out there. So most commonly used with DBAs that we work with. Everybody knows how to do T-SQL. It's a multi-billion-dollar business for Microsoft. It's a multi-million-dollar business with Dell as well. So we're going to continue to be all in on the platforms here. And then the reality is that if we go to the next slide, that there's a journey that literally every one of you are on. And if we looked at the laundry list, and you were asking earlier in the QA, what about 6.0? What about 2000? What about 2005? The reality is there's a whole bunch of mix that's out there. And when we look at it from a legacy point of view, some are using virtualized technologies with 2008, although in 2012 you really saw a jump up in that. A lot of traditional architectures that are running off of a bare metal build. Most of you, though, if I would hazard a guess, are probably in this current mind frame to where Yeah, you're probably still running some instances where you're wanting to take advantage of running it just on the bare metal and consume all the resources from a SQL point of view. But the reality is SQL does really well virtualized, and obviously this is important for the conversation we're having here, because that hypervisor in the host operating system, specifically now with 2017 going into 2019, can reside on a whole bunch of different architectures, and we'll talk about that today. But if we look over the horizon, and this is a very near-term statement, this isn't like 3 years from now, this is maybe next month for you, we're recognizing over and over again that we are living in a containerized world. We might not yet be ready to adopt that yet, but that is absolutely, to use a hockey analogy, where the hockey puck is going. And Dell has seen that for the last, goodness, over a year and a half. We've been doing a huge amount of investment within our Dell EMC infrastructure to make sure that these containerized environments and the orchestration from a Kubernetes perspective, and we're going to talk a lot about that today, we want to make sure that you get persistency. If you notice that little purple dotted line that connects from that persistent volume all the way down to the Dell EMC infrastructure, using tools like Container Storage Interface and what we see from other architecture, specifically like with OpenShift, you're able to get that goodness of knowing where that data is from a persistent perspective. And that was one of the challenges and worries that some people had around containerization, the ephemeralness of this. We're seeing this happen already from a containerization point of view. And as a matter of fact, if you look at it from a hybrid perspective, the data services that Microsoft's providing specifically with Arc, which, by the way, Arc for Data Services is now in public preview, so you can go download and kick the tires on this. That's absolutely the direction that we see going forward. It's not just a Microsoft statement, by the way. We're seeing that with Oracle. We're seeing it with Hadoop. But it absolutely is a reality. And we recognize that for most of you that are looking at, well, I'm making my migration, I got to go from old to new, nobody wants to be pigeonholed into an environment that will not support what's next. And the what's next is containerization and Kubernetes. And if you look at the Dell EMC infrastructure cornucopia of all the things out there, again, we've had some really deep investments to make sure that you're not going to be run into a scenario where you have to forklift stuff out. And whether that's server, converged, HCI, hybrid, all these different flavors of ways that you can address that need, we can definitely show you value around a today and a future point of view. Rob, I don't know if there was a conversation point that you wanted to hit that I might have missed before we go to the next slide.
Yeah, you said a couple that spawned some thoughts here regarding SQL runs really good in a virtualized environment, also runs really, really well in a containerized environment. And in addition to that, a lot of people, you mentioned also around migrations, a lot of that goes on right now. A lot of those are in flight, especially with our conversations. But if you think about that from a containerized world, it's a lot easier, again, focusing in on the persistent volumes there with the CSI drivers. It's very easy to flip a container to the next rev or build of SQL Server using the same data because it's stored down on very solid Dell EMC infrastructure. So if you think about those lift and shift migrations or backup restore migrations that everybody's doing now, I've done them too for years. In a containerized world, those large migrations are going to kind of be a thing of the past. And you can roll backwards too, not only roll forwards. There used to be just a one-way ticket, but there's a lot of really interesting SQL Server modernization stories to be had just talking about these conversations right now. And remember, you can run VMs and bare metal and containerized workloads all together, especially that future statement in the same stack. So let's continue on.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide, Trey. So I really like the summation that you see here, and of course everything's red. We're putting our Red Hat red glasses back on, rose-colored glasses. Well, they're red-colored glasses. Red Hat is absolutely the most widely used Linux operating system out there. And we talked about a minute ago how with SQL Server 2017, they abstracted SQL to where it could run in a Linux operating environment, and it literally is, and we'll talk about it. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. It literally is the same engine that you have within that build as you go to 2019. But why did they do that? Why was it, hey, let's run it on Linux? Well, it goes back to that journey conversation a minute ago. Remember I said it's a containerized world that we live in. In almost every scenario that you look at from a containerization perspective, that underlying OS is probably going to be Linux. The capabilities that you get there are super important. And so from a testing and development point of view, what Microsoft found and working with architectures like what Dell EMC provides, we saw in some scenarios SQL Server 2019 actually runs faster in a Linux point of view than what you can see from a Windows point of view. There's a shim where they're running literally the same SQL engine, and just because of the connects and hooks, in some instances it can run faster. And that's a pretty interesting statement, because for the longest time there was this umbilical cord connection between SQL and Windows Server. And so this gives you a lot of choice. This gives you a lot of ability to make some decisions around where I'm going to make my investments, where does it make more sense. And pulling Red Hat Enterprise Linux into that story becomes pretty interesting, especially considering some of the use cases that are out there. It's definitely something you might want to take advantage of. And so if we go to the next slide and look at just this platform of choice, again, with the idea of commonality that you see, again, the same SQL engine on all these environments, this is that big enablement piece where Red Hat can be that enablement platform so that I can do all these things around containers and Kubernetes. I can pull down from the Microsoft Container Registry the evergreen versions of architecture from a containerization point of view. Red Hat does the same thing as well. And then with Linux, that comes in the box with SQL 2019, they turned on a whole bunch of functionality. It wasn't turned on in 17, and in 19 they turned it on, where I can do cool things, like even to the degree of machine learning. Yeah, that actually comes out of the box with SQL, and I can take advantage of that. I can use Polybase to pull all these disparate data sources. I can pull Oracle. I can pull SAP from a structured point of view, or I can pull Hadoop directly in, and we'll talk about those architectures as well. And so if we get to a summation here on the next slide, there's a bunch of different platforms from a Dell point of view that supports Linux solutions. You see that in the nice red glowing Red Hat colored script there with Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Yes, I can still do stuff around Windows Server, but it gives you the choice and functionality from a Linux perspective. And there's architecture guides and white papers on a number of different portfolio points of view from a Dell EMC perspective, and you'll get a link to all the resources. We want to make sure that you take advantage of that and do some education, because we show you what this actually looks like. It's not just a 5-page solution brief. We're doing 30, 40, 50-page white papers actually running this from an environment. Here's what we saw from that interaction and the value that you can get. And this sets the stage for everything that we're going to be talking about for the rest of the conversation. Because if you build it on a Linux platform, it enables you to do cool things around containers and cool things around some of the SQL Server functionality. So Rob, before we go to the next slide, one of my favorite slides, any comment on the last few things that we covered?
No, I was just answering a question there around, and this will actually go right into the next slide. When will the install procedure be as user-friendly on Linux as it is on Windows? I would argue that it is. Stepping through, an automated install of SQL Server on Windows or Linux, yes, a little bit of scripting differences, but still very much the same. Remember, we're going through the SQL PAL, the platform abstraction layer. That is the shim, for lack of a better phrase, that allows SQL Server to run on either OS, Windows, or Linux, and also on a Linux container. So let's jump to the next slide.
Yeah,
and
let's do that, Trey.
Peeling back that onion. So this is, I'll take over here for a second, Steve, and
Sure.
Thanks everyone for joining. I appreciate it. I didn't do my full thank you introduction, but so there's a lot of color coding here on this screen. So let's start at the bottom here. And we've been talking through this a lot, because when I talk with clients right now around SQL Server and where they want to go, there's a lot of layers in the, call it the stack or the layer cake or the color coding here. Starting on the bottom left, of course, Dell Technologies, the infrastructure, proven, best of breed. There is no SQL Server solution that we cannot solve for right now as Dell. However, if I would just take this whole slide, you could, in theory, go to Dell for all of this, for Microsoft licensing, for Red Hat licensing, for potential VMware licensing, and of course, all the Dell infrastructure and all the goodness and orchestration even that comes, again, starting at the bottom. So if I move up a layer to the virtualization, maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe SQL still needs to be bare metal. Maybe SQL on Linux still needs to be bare metal. That's fine. The next layer, software defined, I would say software defined everything. What are some options there? Red Hat, of course, VMware, maybe some Azure. Maybe you're running Azure Stack HCI or Azure Stack Hub. Maybe you're going to land potentially AKS on one of those, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then now we're at the fourth layer here in the orange disk in the middle, the operating system. Well, we have a choice here, Windows Server or Red Hat Enterprise or any distribution of Linux. Now remember what we're trying to get to here, that only fully supported stack for all these layers does include, the path does go through Red Hat, period. That's the only way from Microsoft, from Red Hat, from VMware, and then from Dell. That's a fully supported stack. Container orchestration would be your OpenShift layer. Of course, that's your Kubernetes, your management layer. And then maybe you have something like Tanzu or Azure Arc or Red Hat Smart Management. And then finally at the very top, we have the application. I mean, we used to just lay the application right down on an OS on bare metal and built a failover cluster instance, and that was our SQL Server environment. Now there's a lot of minutia moving around, and it's really, to use one of Steve's phrases that I like, it's that kind of Plinkle ball analogy. The answer is if this, then this, or if this, then maybe a few other solutions. So it's kind of the gated story as you move through this path, but this is why people like myself are here to help clients work through this decision making. And you have to make all these decisions now, no, but what you should think about absolutely is going down the path, obviously with Dell as your provider, keeping that base infrastructure solid, because I got to be honest, and Buck Woody, one of our friends at Microsoft, talks about this a lot. If your foundation is not solid for Kubernetes, you're going to have problems. So where does the foundation start? With Dell Technologies. I've had my lab environment where I've moved storage around and my Kubernetes environment has kind of tipped over and evicted a lot of nodes, but they do come back. That's the self-healing that you get with Kubernetes. It's also worth mentioning too, not to stay on this too long, but for DBAs right now that may be on the call that hear Linux and hear Kubernetes and these new buzzwords that Microsoft has kind of shoved to the forefront. Now we're talking about all these things for SQL Server. Wow, that's mind expanding. Now it's all a declarative model, just like DBAs select something from something, Mr. SQL Server, go get it and bring back the results when it's done. With Kubernetes or when your developers are laying out a container YAML file, it's the same thing. It's a declarative model. So I would urge you to, if you haven't already started installing SQL on Linux or SQL in a container or SQL Server in a container managed by Kubernetes, start spinning that up. And we've got some links towards the end that'll show how to do that. There's a lot of great Microsoft documentation by Bob and Buck. It's a really, really good place to be. It's a really good place to learn and understand where, again, the puck is going. It's already there for SQL Server. Steve, any thoughts?
Well, and just a statement, there's no one answer, right? So there's a lot of on-ramps and off-ramps as we all walk down this future journey of how we're going to enable all the hybrid coolness that is offered from a Microsoft data services point of view. And if we go to the next slide, you can see an example of what we're seeing a number of customers starting to use. You know, Trey, you said over 2,000 customers are going down the OpenShift path already. And if you look at it from that previous holistic model slide, OpenShift is absolutely foundational for many of you that are on this call to go into that. How do I activate containerization? How do I turn on some of the advanced functionality that SQL 2019 has that comes in the box? And by the way, that's not just a SQL enterprise license statement. Big data clusters and some of the stuff we're going to talk about, some of the machine learning stuff, it comes even on the standard edition of SQL licensing. And foundationally, leveraging something like OpenShift, and I'm working with a number of our product groups. This is the hot new thing. You know, the world doesn't revolve necessarily around a VMware architecture. Leveraging Red Hat and OpenShift, especially when you're looking at it from a containerization perspective, becomes super interesting. And we anticipate that over a period of time, you're actually going to see this red market maybe even get a little bit bigger, because, you know, Docker Swarm, maybe not, you know, what's happening on the other side. Tanzu might get a little bit bigger, but definitely Red Hat is the player here. And that's the reason why we're having this conversation today. We're definitely seeing that now and the future.
Well, I was just going to interject real quick here, Steve, and that's, you know, Red Hat OpenShift, not only is it have 44% of the market, but something a lot of people may or may not know is that it didn't start with Kubernetes with Red Hat OpenShift, right? It actually started back in 2012, and actually they made kind of some inroads in 2011. By 2012, it had been released upstream, and so Red Hat has actually been running a containerized platform known as OpenShift since 2012, far before we ever ran into the native Kubernetes road that we have now. And today, Red Hat would say that, hey, Red Hat OpenShift really is enterprise Kubernetes, right? They made that full adoption into Kubernetes while there was some different infighting trying to decide which container platform was going to win out at the end of the day, and now we all know it's Kubernetes, and so it completely supports that today. But just understand that Red Hat, you know, when we talk about that foundation on that previous slide, all those kind of spree-looking disks as they go across the screen, that foundation, that fully supported stack that we have between Red Hat and Microsoft and Dell and VMware and all those players that come together to help our customers, I think it's important to note that Red Hat has been doing this container part for a very, very long time and is here to support the customers as they're walking through this new journey.
And it's going to be very important here in a few more slides when we start talking about the core component, the Kubernetes architecture that's needed for that SQL big data cluster. So let's keep moving.
Yeah, let's talk about on the next slide. We're absolutely going to hit that. And Trey, you mentioned spree for the earlier slides. You know, my boys went and got Halloween candy yesterday, and you better believe there's a big old bag of spree in there. I love that slide. So, yeah, if we look at it from a Red Hat OpenShift container platform point of view, you know, this is that holistic model that we talked about earlier made real, where you can see you're not limited from an infrastructure point of view. If you're doing bare metal, if you're doing virtualized platform, if you're doing a true private cloud or any degree of hybrid, because there's so many cool things coming from a public cloud perspective and Arc, and we'll talk about those data services. The foundational layer in ensuring that you have that solid storage foundation that Rob was just mentioning with Buck, you know, Red Hat Enterprise Linux going up through Kubernetes and the automation and the mesh services that you have makes it a fantastic landing spot for all of these things that we're talking about. SQL 2019 as well as Arc data services. And before we go to the poll, Rob, do you have an observation on this, or should we go right into the poll?
You know, this is again, to reiterate, that holistic model, that stack, and this is probably an expanded towards the top of what you get with Red Hat OpenShift, their container platform, which is, again, best of breed is what you really want for a productionalized environment. I get that a lot of people right now will test the waters with other versions of Linux potentially for non-prod, but to go to production, you really need Red Hat, the only supported stack that you can, or the supported really Linux distribution that you would really want in production. So this is absolutely the way to go. Let's keep moving.
Awesome, thank you guys. I'm enjoying the talking about Halloween and the spree. It gets me excited about that. Good stuff. My kids have some great ideas for costumes. They're all teenagers now, and they wear these elaborate costumes this year. So good stuff. Poll time. So again, we are here at poll time, where you can join by text with your Dell Axiom if you still have one of those around. Join by web with pollev.com. Hit Dell poll and then enter in your name and respond to the activity. All right, we also have the app again. So you guys did great last time, so we're going to hit the next question really quickly, and that is, Are you currently supporting a DevOps cycle with your database workloads? What we mean, are you using a DevOps cycle like Agile, right, as opposed to a waterfall methodology? And while I'll let people answer that, I'm going to pull in a live question we had here, Rob, and let you respond while we see this poll. Mm-hmm. It says here we had a person ask, I'm a SQL DBA. I don't have experience with Linux, but I've tried to install SQL on Linux, but it seems like a mountain to climb with errors. I'd love instructions on how to install it on Linux, including troubleshooting common errors, things like that. So I'll let you respond while we run the poll here.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm happy to reach out to me afterwards because I have a myriad of let's call it the SQL, as everybody does, my virtual toolkit with scripts, not only from a Linux or SQL on Linux, but a SQL on Linux on a container and a SQL on Linux in a container in a big data cluster. All of it is very scripted. Again, it's not the GUI that there are even tools. Think about Azure Data Studio, ADS, another great way to install SQL Server on Linux. It's not a replacement for SSMS, SQL Server Management Studio. But yeah, I would be happy to have a side conversation. It's not hard. It's not challenging. I'd love to see the errors that you're getting, and we can just have a screen share and go through it. Perfectly happy to help there.
Well, great. I appreciate you offering that, Rob. That's fantastic to know. But also, I think, and we have a thank you there from him. What I'd like to do as well is when we send out those links, I'll get with you and we'll include some of those links. I think that'd be helpful to share with the whole group. So
sure,
sure we can include that as part of the response to you guys today. It's a great question. Fantastic. All right. So are you currently supporting a DevOps cycle with your database workloads? We've got a bunch of people responding here. It looks like overall the response is considering your yes is about 2/3 of you, and the no is about a third or so, a little more than a third of you. So that's a great way of looking at it, because when we look through that fully supported stack and that kind of that spree layers, we can see that, different people and different corporations and businesses and organizations are all at different spots in that, adoption of the Agile method. So let's move on to the next slide here and let's talk about it. So I'll hand it back to you guys. Steve, Rob, what about SQL Server and containers? Why is that a good idea to move to that more Agile method?
Yeah,
Rob,
I love.
go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love the first two bullets from left to right. VMs are in a box. Containers are the applications in a box. So just the binaries, the application binaries and the OS binaries that are needed to run that application. That's it for containers. They're very light. They're very portable. Especially when you introduce other management systems over the top for managing those containers managed by Kubernetes. We're going to talk about Arc here in a little bit. And then jumping down to the bottom, containers are meant to be ephemeral. And that was the hardest part to get even my head around a few years ago around, also you want my database to live and die. Well, that's not going to work because I'm an old DBA and I want my data to remain forever. I want it to be backed up, moved around, and restored. So that is where containers really shine. Again, using all the way back to the beginning when we saw that slide, that hook down to that persistent storage. That is how a container can be quote unquote non-ephemeral or long-lived. Even if you want to crush the container and bring it back, it will rehook to that data. Startup times, from an app dev perspective, or think again from a CI/CD pipe perspective, startup times are seconds for SQL Server in the container, absolutely seconds. So it's absolutely should be part of your DevOps cycle from the previous poll. It goes right into that. I'd love to have that conversation because that's absolutely where you should be for SQL Server if you're going to adopt those cycles. If your developers want more timely access to the data, you can spin this up on a laptop if you had to. Now, obviously, there's some data scrubbing and persistence to think about there, all very doable. But that's really the difference between virtual machines and containers. Interesting. It's a good conversation to have. So let's keep going in the interest of time.
Yeah, keep running, Rob. Let's talk about SQL, though. SQL in containers, right?
Yep. So I talked about this earlier, that green database there, where everybody on the call wants to maintain their MDFs, NDFs, and LDFs. For obvious reasons. Well, hooking to those containers, we talked about switching for upgrades right there in the top right. You can roll forward, roll back. This is that migration path to the latest version of SQL Server that is no longer this lift and shift or back up and restore. very portable, very lightweight, and then consistency, managing. It was the question earlier around installing SQL Server on Linux. Well, it is scripted, and that's perfect because that's repeatable. That's not error prone, and very fast and very efficient for less downtime. It really gets that whole DevOps, call it GitOps, call it flavor of the month for operations. But this really, because the database was always that one layer that kind of sat in this monolith where there could be a lot of DevOps going on, but still the database was there and nobody wanted to touch it. Or you still had to drag the database team along. Now, it's right and part of that cycle. It's exactly the same as your developers are already working with their code or should be working with their code. It walks lockstep. So let's continue on.
Yeah, and let's just hit this slide real quick. So the journey conversation, we started off, talking about how do you get from here to there. The first was, SQL on Linux, and when we showed you that there's a bunch of different Dell platforms and white papers and reference architectures, and the same is true on the containers piece. So again, the ability for you to pull these down from the resources section will be available at the end of this deck. But there is a very broad feature set that leverages that shim that makes containerization possible with that CSI plugin across a very broad cornucopia, to use that term, of Dell platform. So I think there's a poll. If we want to go ahead and hit that next, Trey.
Yeah, absolutely. There we go. All right. So again, you can join by text, you can join by web, you can join with the app. So we'll head right into the next poll. All right. Microsoft SQL, big data clusters, not running them, considering them, testing them, or I'm running them in production. So I'd like to see, we had some bets going as to which one would win out here. So let's see what folks have to say on the line today. It looks like, too, by the way, we're really proud of you guys as far as the number of the people that signed up and attended with us today. We've got about 96 of you out there with us with 6 panelists. We've got over 100 people on the phone today. It's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining and participating with us today. All right, so we got 62% of you saying not running it. There are some of you already in production. That's pretty awesome, especially since it's been out a little less than 12 months. It was announced last November at Ignite, so that's pretty impressive. And there are a lot of information. There's a lot of information we will share at the end of the presentation with the links that we've all been referring to that talk about SQL BDC on OpenShift and things like that. Fantastic. Well, great. Well, let's move on to the next one. I think it's time to talk a little bit about SQL BDC. And guys, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, sorry, I was answering a few questions live. And Michael, great question. I'm going to answer this one live. Do the SQL 2019 feature set align one-to-one with Windows and Linux? And we're asked this a lot. And the answer is mostly yes. Some of the features like SSRS, think about all the ancillary services that come out of the box with SQL Server. Everybody on the call knows that's a crazy robust tool set. It's not pick what you want. You have all of this at your fingertips, so use what you want. It's not on par, but it's the same SQL core engine. I can tell you all the SQL Server engine functionality is there. It's exact because of that shim, that SQL PAL, the platform abstraction layer. When it comes to a few of the ancillary services, no, and whether those come or not because of a GUI remains to be seen. So there's a few links that I'll send out here at the end that kind of matrix that out for you, what's available, what's not. But it's a substantial list right now. There's zero reason why, from a SQL Server engine perspective, you wouldn't be running it on Linux. Just think about it's the same, just if you would compare it maybe something like Windows Core, that same type of experience. So let's move here to the SQL 2019 big data cluster. So now we're starting to make that holistic model, or that layer cake, or the multicolored candy slide that we had there. This first box, and I'd like to stop here for a second because there's two things to take away right here before we throw a whole bunch of icons on the screen. That SQL Server master instance is the gateway to get to all the SQL Server big data cluster functionality. Using what? Using Transact SQL, the most widely used language in the world. Your data scientists can go off and do their Python and R that can be folded into what? A SQL procedure using Transact SQL and execute it against the big data cluster. One requirement on the right, this is hard and fast. You need a Kubernetes environment to orchestrate all the containers that will be deployed across the storage, the data, and the compute pools, and you'll see that in a second. So Trey, let's build away here. So boom, there's a whole bunch of, and this is an eye chart. I get it. We have a few additional eye charts here that we didn't put in this deck. Now, originally when we first saw this, circa probably a couple years ago, we thought, wow, we have to build all this. No, everything is built and deployed. In fact, to mention a tool that I talked about earlier, Azure Data Studio, you can deploy, in fact, I have a small lab environment with a single node cluster, Kubernetes cluster, deployed with about 4 scripts. Or you can do it with, like I mentioned, Azure Data Studio. We have the compute node in the middle there, or the compute pool, sorry, with SQL Server XE nodes, and as part of their pods. And then we have the data lake on the bottom left, which can have hooks to HDFS external tiering. That could be, again, another Dell product, PowerFlex, and then we have the SQL data pool, which is where, think of the data pool as almost a caching layer. So when you're going out and you're using Apache Spark or Polybase to connect all the data sources together and pull them in, that's your caching layer where your data can be just that, warmed up. And then if you want to store it and maintain it, you would then insert it into the master instance. And of course, availability groups are part of it, Active Directory for role-based access. But I have some clients right now that are using a SQL Server big data cluster simply to ingest all the data things. Think of it as your data hub for maybe those old SQL Server 2000 or 6.0 instances that data is still valuable, but maybe the app is going to eventually be retired. Just leave it there and source it in. That's an option. We have a lot of clients doing that. And then the custom maps on the top and the analytics and the BI, it's all coming through potentially the same SQL Server procedure, just with some changes inside the proc code, sourcing to various sources below here in this Kubernetes cluster. The custom apps or the BI or the analytics don't know the difference. The data is simply enriched and more robust with everything you see on the screen here. So I'll pause for a second. Steve, thoughts?
Get myself off mute here. Yeah, it's an eye chart, but it's super cool. This is where you get a lot of the feature functionality that was only available for a while up in Azure Public Cloud on-prem. The capability of you being able to address all the data and get insight off of all of that data is reality here. And Trey, if we build out the next piece, the last part of the slide build, that Kubernetes control plane that Rob mentioned, that whole box is in Kubernetes, but you get cool stuff with the Kubernetes control plane on addressing this. So
yeah. And again, it's all declarative. This, just because these are interesting new phrases to go in the same sentence as SQL Server, that I love working with Kubernetes because it absolutely walks lockstep with what I did for SQL Server, and still do for SQL Server for years. It's declarative. So don't be afraid of it, embrace it, because it's powerful right now that you get out of the box with any version of Kubernetes, OpenShift included.
So let's keep the conversation going. I know that we're getting close to time here. If we think about the next detail here in the Journey platform, and then again, this goes all the way back to what slide number 4, one of the first slides we talked about. If you're doing a bare metal on-prem architecture or spin the dial all the way to the right and look at the containerization and big data cluster perspective, rest assured that from a Red Hat perspective, there is a opportunity to do something there, right? The enablement around that holistic model becomes very true. This is an example that we're leveraging specifically with PowerFlex because we've done quite a few white papers on that architecture, but it's not exclusive to PowerFlex. I can talk about many of the other Dell EMC architectures that are out there. Well, as a matter of fact, on the next slide, we do talk about this. So making all of that stuff real from a big data cluster perspective, we feel at Dell that we definitely are thought leaders here we got very aggressively invested into this. We had our first white paper that came out on Flex with Big Data Cluster back in February. We've done a number of white papers in detail, again, 60-page detailed white papers of where we're not just talking about theory. We're running it, and this is the results we got and how we did it. So again, in the resources section, I think that's going to be super important for a bunch of you. Again, very broad architecture support from servers through HCI, CI, the whole deal. Now, one of the things that was super interesting with Ignite in last November, and then again Ignite a week ago, if we go to the next slide, was the discussion around Arc, Azure Arc. And what is Arc? Well, Arc, A-R-C, Arc is to be honest, is a marketing term of about three, actually more different products that were enabled. There's some cool stuff that went GA last week around Azure Arc for servers, and yes, I can put a SQL agent in on that, and they just went to public preview around Azure Arc for Kubernetes and managing at scale those Kubernetes containerization orchestration. But what was really cool, and I'm sorry I'm putting my data-centric hat on here, is the Azure Arc Data Services that also went into public preview instead of just private preview. So if we go to the next slide, and Rob, you might want to spend a minute here as we're getting near the end of time. The idea around what our Azure Data Services are bringing to the table. Again, the requirement is that these are running in a containerized environment. But the data services around Azure SQL and PostgreSQL, as well as what's next, they kind of hinted at some of the what next stuff is. Go ahead, Rob.
So it's managing all that sprawl, that container sprawl, because we did talk about virtualization sprawl. Now we have hundreds of multiples of containerized sprawl or Kubernetes sprawl. I have a good friend who does a demo with SQL Server running on his lab, and he moves it in a container, moves it to AWS and manages the entire process with Azure Arc. So what this allows you, again, with Postgres and SQL Server, potentially via, again, there's that top left icon, Azure Data Studio. If you're not using it, I would embrace it. To really ramp up, ramp down as resources require, as your workloads require. This, again, allows you to, that's what they call that hyperscale, and there's future services, which is a big kind of little breadcrumb there, that are going to be lit up, enabled as containers coming down the road. That's super interesting. Microsoft is all in here with this story. This is just the tip of the iceberg of controlling all those containerized workloads wherever they reside. And the biggest takeaway is this is all workloads on premises. SQL Server in your data center, servers in your data center, Kubernetes in your data center, and SQL Server in your data center on those instances that you already have running. That's a big deal.
Well, hey, we got a few minutes left, but let's get to some of the summation details. So, Trey, if we can go to the next slide. The reality is, for many of you that are on this journey, containerization might still be a little bit outside your comfort zone, and that's cool because it definitely was for us too, with our engineering teams as recently as a year ago. And having somebody that's actually been working in the containerized architectures within our Dell Services team might be super interesting to you, because the relationship we've had with Microsoft of over 35 years, we have more Partner of the Year awards than anybody out there. We got all the competencies that matter, and there's 16,000 of our brothers and sisters at Dell that support these Microsoft platforms, including the capability of running on Red Hat environments. And again, a number of different flavors to answering that question. So I think if we want to go to the QA section, we got about 5 minutes left, and I think there's a couple of wrap-ups.